Ever since the release of episode Ardan, Bahamut has had a bad rap in the Final Fantasy XV fandom. But setting aside Dawn of the Future's attempted character assassination, I would argue that this assessment is quite unfair. Bahamut, as he exists in canon, isn't some inhuman deity who demands arbitrary suffering. Rather, he's a surprisingly effective personification of divine providence. In Final Fantasy XV, Providence is the power greater than the astrals which Noctis must channel through the crystal at the cost of his life. As one might expect, the concept of divine providence as understood by theologians is a bit more complex. To properly assess Bahamut's attitude and behavior, however, it's critical to recognize this broader context. Divine providence is at the heart of one of the most significant flashpoints in all of theology, the question of predestination. Virtually every position on this topic has been held by one denomination or another. John Calvin sought to preserve God's omnipotent sovereignty by insisting that human free will has nothing to do with God's choice to predestine some to heaven and some to hell. Open theists consider free will so non-negotiable that they reject predestination altogether and question whether even God can know the future infallibly. Final Fantasy XV's take on this concept, I'd argue, falls somewhere in between. The game clearly assumes some form of predestination, given the existence of an accurate ancient prophecy regarding the night when all comes to naught. But it's equally clear that Bahamut, at least as portrayed in the game, sees Ardan as truly responsible for the consequences of his actions. A middle position of this sort was explored in detail by Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, the providence of God is nothing less than the type of the order of things towards an end. He does not see this as incompatible with the existence of contingent causes like free will, however. Rather, he contends that it pertains to divine providence to produce every grade of being, and thus it is prepared for some things necessary causes, so that they happen of necessity, for others contingent causes, that they may happen by contingency, according to the nature of their proximate causes. Predestination, then, builds upon rather than undercuts contingency. If a thing cannot obtain to something by the power of its nature, it must be directed thereto by another. Thus, an arrow is directed by the archer toward a mark. Hence, properly speaking, a rational creature, capable of eternal life, is led towards it, directed, as it were, by God. Such direction of a rational creature towards the end of life eternal is called predestination, for to destine is to direct or send. The flight of an arrow might seem fully deterministic given the arrow's lack of agency, but I don't think that's what Aquinas intended to imply. Updating the analogy to use a more modern weapon might make the concept clearer. An Excalibur artillery shell, like an arrow, is launched on a ballistic trajectory and provided with the momentum and guidance it needs to hit its predestined target. But unlike the arrow, it's difficult to argue that autonomous end-seeking actions taken by the Excalibur in accordance with its design and external guidance aren't a major factor in its ultimate success. Human beings, likewise, are directed by providence, but must freely cooperate with their predestined ends. While predestination towards eternal life is directly willed by God, however, sins which lead to damnation derive solely from the free will of the reprobate. Reprobation includes the will to permit a person to fall into sin, and to impose the punishment of damnation on account of that sin. To return to the Excalibur analogy, an Excalibur with a malfunctioning guidance system could not be said to be predestined toward anything. It would quite reasonably be written off as a failure on account of its shortcoming, and whatever parts of it remain salvageable would be repurposed to support viable units. This interpretation of providence and predestination, I would argue, can help us understand Bahamut's characterization. While it does little to mitigate the coldness of his demeanor, it does suggest that his treatment of Noctis and Ardan, at least in the context of the game, can fully accommodate the freedom of their respective wills. If Noctis is willing and able to accept guidance while Ardan isn't, they're effectively filling the roles of the functioning and malfunctioning Excaliburs respectively. Noctis is predestined to restore light to the world. He receives divine guidance and divine assistance towards that end as an act of providence. But he's not a passive victim of fate. He accepts that guidance and assistance through a free act of his will and thereby autonomously pursues his predestined end. Ardan, in contrast, is permitted both to overreach and to suffer the consequence of that overreach. Ardan is not a slave to fate. He's a man who actively corrupted himself by misusing powers he had been granted without guidance. That his misbehavior is predestined to serve the world's ultimate good does not necessarily imply that the actions that led to his downfall were not freely willed on his part. Outside of episode Ardan, then, Bahamut says nothing that denies the existence of free will. With that said, given that the Bahamut depicted in episode Ardan does directly deny the existence of free will, what are we to make of that? Here's where I'll note that episode Ardan is not internally consistent. The developers explained that within the Dawn of the Future continuity, the Submit to Fate ending was meant to lead to the canon ending, and the Resist Your Fate ending was meant to lead to Dawn of the Future. But the connection to Dawn of the Future had to be dropped when the rest of the DLC was cancelled, which left the endings in a strange state of limbo. Without Dawn of the Future's thematic need to reward resisting one's fate, it makes very little sense for Submit to Fate to be the canon ending, because Ardan doesn't actually submit. The moment he wakes up in Angel Guard, he makes it abundantly clear that he's not going to let Noctis kill him and restore the light. Rather, he declares that he's going to kill the King of Light and leave Eos drenched in the darkness of despair for time eternal. The Resist Your Fate ending, in contrast, transitions neatly into the canon outcome. Ardan engages in exactly the sort of impotent defiance one would expect from a man who attempted to resist the ring's cleansing power even after both he and Noctis were already dead, and Bahamut responds by stating, "If thou wilt fight against fate, so shall it be," and subjecting him to hallucinations similar to the ones he had previously experienced and would shortly experience again. But therein, I'd argue, lies the rub. Ardan hallucinates. His characterization of Somnus is inaccurate. He's tormented by a request from Era that she never actually made. Why should his interpretation of Bahamut be any less compromised? The most coherent way to interpret the end of episode Ardan, then, is that both endings are canonical hallucinations. Ardan doesn't remember what actually happened. Sometimes he imagines himself being cowed in the moment by a tyrant, sometimes he imagines himself heroically resisting that tyrant's torture. But in neither case is his recollection accurate. Bahamut simply showed up, explained what role Ardan had blundered into in the upcoming cosmic drama, and gave him over to the mercy of his own twisted psyche. What then should one make of Bahamut? I'd argue that he's an ambivalent figure, not by accident, but by design. Bahamut represents Providence and predestination, and speaks of the given circumstances within which Noctis and Ardan's wills freely operate to bring about an expected outcome. That he does not appear emotionally affected by the cost they must bear, apart from one specific entry in the official comic anthology, allows him to fill this role all the more effectively. While the game doesn't directly address the question of whether it's good or bad for human beings to be caught up in the designs of Providence, it certainly vindicates Noctis' decision to trust Bahamut. The sun rises and the demons are banished as promised. Noctis and Luna are unexpectedly rewarded with a blissful spiritual union. No matter how unpleasant one might find the Draconian or the Providence he represents, then, it's clear that in the context of the game, Bahamut did nothing wrong.